Shalom, my name is Yair Davidiy. I'm speaking to you from Israel, from the land of Israel. Today we are about to discuss the probable fate of Britain if the Nazis had conquered Britain in the Second World War. What would have happened to the British people according to the records or the plans the Nazis had drawn up to do with the British people? This is significant because it could happen again, and because it also tells us of something about how nations seem to react with each other, and the psychology of different nations, and the destiny of certain peoples. So it's worth noting. It's worth knowing about, especially since recently historians and popular writers and bloggers and so on have been presenting a picture of Germany as being both good and bad, of Hitler having had positive and negative sides, that he may have been bad to the Jews, bad to the Poles, but he wouldn't have been so bad to the British, and he was good to the Germans in some ways, and so on. And this is wrong. This is a misrepresentation. It is a distortion of the facts, of the reality as we understand it from a study of history. So let us see what was planned to do with the British people and what happened. We had the Second World War. In 1933, Hitler and the Nazis came to power. Immediately they began to persecute the Jews, to dispossess the Jews of their possessions, to expel Jews from universities, from institutions, from public service, from all kinds of professions, and from many aspects of public life, eventually all aspects of public life, to take their lives and their property and everything they had away from them. This is what they proceeded to do. They also began a process of rearmament, of preparing themselves to go to war with the rest of the world. And they went ahead and doing what they had planned to do, doing what they were about to do. In the process, they annexed, or they created a union with Austria, took over Austria in 1938. Also in 1938, they took over part of Czechoslovakia. In 1939, they took over what remained of Czechoslovakia, even though they had promised not to. And also they attacked Poland. As a result of attacking Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany, went to war with Germany. So too did the British dominions, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, all declared war on Germany as they were part of the British dominions, they were part of the British presence in the world. And so we had the war. Poland was attacked. Poland was divided between Russia and Germany. Russia at that time, USSR, was in effect an ally of Germany, a partner of Germany. They participated with Germany in the petition in dividing Poland up between them. Also, Russia supplied Germany with a lot of raw materials, with oil, with essential metals, with grains, with all kinds of materials that were needed to maintain the war effort. They got them from Russia. Russia was on good terms with Germany, and the Russians were under the impression that these good terms would continue indefinitely. In the meantime, Russia also attacked Finland and went to war with Finland. And this was the situation. In the West, you had Britain and France fighting or at war with Germany. In 1940, the Germans invaded France, also invaded Holland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. Just before then, they'd also invaded Norway and Denmark and conquered them. They defeated the British and the French armies in France. And then a good portion of the British armies and also some of the French managed to get away from Dunkirk to Britain. And Britain was locked up in this island, and the Germans dominated the rest of the continent. France had been divided into two different sections. In the north it was occupied. In the southern section they had an independent protectorate, more or less under German domination. In the south it was known as the Vichy, after the place where the treaties were signed. So this was the situation. Hitler began to make overtures to Britain to offer Britain generous peace terms, what he considered to be generous peace terms. The British refused, and so the Germans prepared to invade Britain. They would have to take their armies overseas to Britain, and in order to do so they had to get rid of the British air protection so that they would be able to cross the seas with impunity. Just as a remark, we should note the relative strengths of the forces. The Germans' armies, their foot soldiers, their men on the ground were much better, or relatively better at least, than anyone else, better than the British. The German Navy was not as good as the British, even though the Germans had submarines, U-boats, which were quite effective at the beginning. The German artillery and the German tanks were much better. The Air Force, they considered it had a reputation. It should have been better, but it proved not to be as good as that of the British, though it was touch and go for a while. And so this was the situation. The British had a better navy, they had better intelligence. Their intelligence services could tell them what the Germans were planning to do, and they could also mislead the Germans as to what was being planned for them. And also the British scientists were better. They were producing or finding solutions to different problems. And their social arrangements were much better. They managed to place their economy on a wall fitting, and in a relatively short period, to be outproducing Germany. And this was without mentioning the fact that under Lend-Lease, the USA began to supply Britain with everything it needed, including war materials, including ships, destroyers, aeroplanes, trucks, food, mineral resources. Anything Britain wanted, the USA would give it to her, virtually without having to pay anything. It was under an arrangement whereby Britain might in the future have to pay, but at the moment she did not have to do so, and she could get whatever she wanted. The USA turned itself into a vast hinterland with factories working 24 hours a day or working extra shifts and so on to supply war material for Britain to use against Germany. And after that also they supplied Russia. Russian trucks, American trucks helped Russian soldiers, even American boots, everything that was needed, that was supplied by the USA, or at least a good portion of it. So this should be remembered. This should also be kept into consideration. At first, the Germans had submarines, U-boats that were sinking ships that were bringing supplies to Britain. At a certain point, many of the ships trying to get through to supply Britain were being sunk. Eventually, the British overcame this problem as well with the help of America. This was the situation, and the Germans wanted or tried to achieve air superiority over the British skies to destroy the British Air Force. It was what is known as the Battle of Britain, and they lost. They were defeated. After it was touch and go, there was one stage when the British were not able to produce enough planes to replace the planes that were being shot down. But they managed to get over it, to get through that period, and eventually to come out as the victors. Then the Germans diverted their sources to bombing, to terror bombing of British cities. And also this too did not work until eventually the Germans were forced to abandon their plans of invasion of Britain. Should not, the Germans also were allied with Italy. Italy was fighting alongside Germany, so was Romania and Hungary and Bulgaria, at least to some degree. So this was the situation. And when the Germans found that they couldn't take Britain down, but they were nothing, and that Britain was getting stronger all the time, and America was supplying Britain and serving as a hinterland for Britain, the Germans felt that they needed a hinterland of their own. Also, the whole psychology, the whole impetus of what they were doing required them to keep on fighting, keep on killing, keep on robbing other nations of their gold reserves, of their resources, and taking forced labour from other people, from other nations, and bringing them into Germany and making them to work and to keep the farms and the factories going, to replace the soldiers who were away fighting at the front. And this was something that had to be done. They felt they had to continue. They also had the aim of destroying all the Jews in the world, and this took priority, to be able to conquer every area of Jewish concentration, to take domination of those areas and to put the Jews to death. And they partially succeeded. They killed a good portion of the Jews in Europe. More than 6 million people were exterminated, men, women and children. They also killed tens of millions of other people from other countries, but this was more or less incidental, something of what they were doing. They just killed people, liked to kill people. They were like criminals, people who are a little bit crazy. We've all met types like that, who there's no real rationale to what they're doing there. It's more of a lust to do things, but the more intelligent amongst them sometimes try and put a rationale to give logical explanations in a de facto manner. So this is how we also have to consider Germany at the time. Centuries of German military culture had come to fruition. It was something that could not be stopped. Once they had begun, they could not turn back. They had to keep going. They needed to feed on something. They needed to take something. They needed another victim. And the only victim available was Russia. So they invaded Russia, even though Russia, the USSR, had been on friendly terms with them, had been actually a faithful ally to them, and had been supplying them with what they had needed to keep going. They nevertheless attacked Russia. They took Russia by surprise, and much of Russia was overrun. Millions of Russians were murdered. And Russia was in danger of defeat, but here too Russia pulled itself together. They managed to reply, to counterattack, to mass their people, and together to produce war material of their own, as well as receiving vast quantities from USA. American trucks, American boots, American weapons, all helped the Russians to defeat the Germans and to drive the Germans back in the direction of Germany. And so this was the overall picture. Eventually, the Germans were defeated. They invaded North Africa. They were almost defeated the Allies in North Africa, but they were held back. Then they were beaten by the British, and then the Americans came in when Japan attacked America in 1941. Attacked Hawaii, and then it also attacked the Philippines, attacked the British colonies of Hong Kong and Malaya. And so there was a war with Japan in the east. Japan had, at the very beginning of the war, attempted to attack Russia and had been defeated, so then they diverted their attention to more easier targets, more to the south, more easier, more lucrative targets in Indonesia, which had a lot of oil and rubber and raw resources that Japan wanted. And so a war went on in this region. They also probably intended to invade Australia. They were stopped in New Guinea by Australian American troops. After that, the American ships managed to catch the Japanese in a couple of big battles and destroy the Japanese fleets. And then everywhere the Allies managed to push the Japanese out and back into Japan. Also in China, which the Japanese had conquered, or most of which the Japanese had conquered, the Chinese, together with Americans and British assistance, also managed to push the Japanese back and took a couple of atom bombs to persuade the Japanese to surrender. So too, in concerning the Germans, the British and the Allies managed to push the Germans out of their conquered areas. The Allies invaded Italy via Sicily. They also invaded France, landed in France on D-Day, and then they pushed the Germans back into Germany and eventually met up with the Russians who were coming in from the east, and Hitler committed suicide. So that is just an overall pattern of what happened, of what the Second World War was all about. So now we're going to discuss what would have happened to the British if the German planes had gone ahead and they had have conquered Britain, and they had have been successful in their conquest, and they had have installed the type of programs that they considered. The Germans had already appointed a Professor Dr. Franz Six, who was a member of the SS, and he had drew up plans, programs for what would happen to the British. Most of the British males would be taken into Europe and used as slave labour in Germany, in the conquered areas, whereas the British females would be used to produce a new race. SS men would fertilise the females and they would produce a new people. They would also create colonies in the Balkan and in the Baltic regions of British people who would be taken out of Britain and planted there. And also, we also know that that Hitler may have wanted the destruction of Britain. There's a story related by Speer, Albert Speer, who was a senior minister in economic productions minister of Nazi Germany, and he relates having seen a newsreel which at the end of this newsreel they had a depiction of bombs, of German bombers destroying the British Isles, in a paper model as if to say. And Hitler saw this and he exulted and he was happy. And he said, "That's it, we shall destroy them, we shall annihilate them." And that was one of the intentions, one of the possibilities that the Germans had considered. The Germans considered the British to be their rivals, to be like them, and therefore potent enemies against them. We should remember that Eichmann, who oversaw the killing of the Jews in Hungary, he said that we should not leave any Jews alive because those Jews who will survive will be the toughest of them all, and they will pose a greater danger to Germany in the future. And therefore this attitude towards the Jews, it was part of their Darwinistic evolutionary survival of the fittest type of mentality. The person who kills the most is the chief of the boys, as if to say. And therefore they also would have had the same attitude towards the British. The British had proven themselves to be serious rivals to the Germans, and therefore the British people as we know it would have had to be eliminated. By analogy, we may take the case of the Dutch. The Dutch were conquered by the Germans. The Dutch, there was a Dutch resistance, but it was not overwhelming. Also, many of the Dutch people served in the German forces. There were quite a few collaborators in the Netherlands with the Germans, and nevertheless, the Dutch on the whole were considered too pro-Jewish and not Aryan enough for the German liking. So the intention was to take all of the Dutch people and put them into Poland. Meanwhile, Poland would have been depopulated of Poles. All the Poles would have been killed or Germanized or taken away to somewhere else or whatever. And put the Dutch people in there and they would get toughened up on the frontiers, those who survived. That was the idea of the Germans. Towards the end of the war, the Germans were taking all the raw resources that the Dutch people needed, were taking away their food stocks and so on, and leaving the Dutch people to starve. And if the Allies had not defeated Germany and not been able to resupply the Dutch people in time, a good portion of the population of Holland would have probably starved to death. So this is what they did to people they were friendly with, people they were sympathetic with. You can see what they would do with people who they imagined to be serious rivals and potent enemies of theirs. The fate could have been much worse. So may we not know of troubles. May the Lord God of Israel bless all of us. Thank you.